print since 1922. Like, come on.
What is the most memorable conversation that you've ever had about James Joyce?
Oof, that's a tough question. Because the thing is, I've had a lot of conversations about James Joyce, specifically with you.
Okay.
And they've all been fantastic. They've all been excellent, but there's none that like really, in terms of like a conversation, really stand out. I remember in high school, and this is probably like goes in with another one of the questions you were asking, but I remember in high school, I had a high school teacher my high school English teacher in grade 12. We talked briefly about James Joyce in the sense that, you know, he mentioned that he had read Ulysses. It took him like years to do it in like 3 attempts or something. And then he tried to read Finnegan's Wake. So he read us the first page of Finnegan's Wake. So this is probably not like a memorable conversation, but more just like a memorable encounter with Joyce. Because I remember, like, I very clearly remember him reading the first page of Finnegan's Wake to us. And it just being, I remember talking about like the language of the day versus the language of the night. Which is what, in the language of dreams, which I think is what Finnegan's Wake's supposed to be. And I specifically now, as a result of this, associate Joyce with the word bisexical.
Hey, very good. That's an important one. I like that one.
I don't know why.
The other one that I remember from Finnegan's Wake is in the Wake, he coins the term quark. So whenever I'm talking to someone in physics, I'm always like, we provided that. But yeah, that's cool. So was that your like first time that you had heard of Joyce, or?
No, that was just a particularly memorable one because Finnegan's Wake was just such, like, even just the first page was just such an experience for me. But that wasn't my first encounter with James Joyce. My first, I was much younger. My family, we all read a lot. I think it was probably when we got 501 must-read books, because it's just a book of books that you need to read. And they're not necessarily picked because they're like great books. They're picked because they're representative of a genre, or they're really influential or something like that. I mean, what makes them a great book isn't because they're like good to read necessarily. But Ulysses is one of them, because of I'm assuming because of its influence. And so I think that might have been my first encounter, because since then, like, I got to like when I was a kid. This has been like my lifelong project, just read every book in that book. But yeah, I remember having conversations about Joyce growing up, talking about like, oh my gosh, he's so hard to read, he's almost incomprehensible. And then my dad being like, but Portrait is a good book, and I highly recommend it. So yeah, I think my first encounter with Joyce was probably around the time we got Find Your Own Must Read books. Which came out in like 2006. So I think that kind of tells you how long we've had it.
Okay. Interesting. So in the context of sort of like the types of books and why they were included in 501 books and sort of your knowledge of that, how would you describe Ulysses? Like, what is it that makes it have a place in 501 books?
You know what? I am not sure. It's one of those entries that I've kind of glossed over. It's in the modern fiction section. I think it's in modern fiction. Yeah, it is. And I kind of glossed over because, you know, me as a kid was like, science fiction, let's go. Yeah. So I've read a lot of like the children's fiction and science fiction section, but not necessarily so much in the modern fiction. So I don't really remember why they included it.
Who is James Joyce?
That's an interesting question. I was thinking about this morning because I made notes. I came prepared.
Wow.
But I'm not really sure in that sense. Part of me wants to say that he's a revolutionary.
Okay.
In more ways than one. Revolutionary, perhaps in the way that he wrote, in the kinds of things the way he wrote, and the kinds of things he wrote about. Again, I've only read like 2 things by him, so I can't really make that case. And also, I think it might have been you that told me that he was involved in like the Easter Rising or something, or no, I might be thinking Francis Skeffington. So he was contemporaries. He was part of that movement. So that, I don't know. Maybe that's how I say he was a revolutionary, literary revolutionary. I also know he was part of technically the Lost Generation because I read that article last week on the BBC about it.
You mentioned that you read 2 things by Joyce. What are those 2 things, and what were your experiences with them?
Okay, so the first thing I read by Joyce was The Dead, and that was in a group We did it for Epiphany 2020, if I remember correctly, which is funny because I didn't actually remember it until you mentioned, like, oh, but you read The Dead the other day. For some reason, it totally blanked out about it, which is funny because I've done things since then. Like, I remember I planned a Shakespeare, like, read along with friends because in a similar style, because I wanted to recreate it, but then I forgot about the originator of that idea. I don't know, but I remember I had a lot of fun reading this short story in a group with a number of people. And I really enjoyed the short stories. I think some of the Dubliners, I haven't gone back to the Dubliners since then, but I had a lot of fun with it when I read it. The other thing I read is a lecture. I believe it's a lecture. I don't know. I have it saved from a book of yours. I have it saved on my computer as James Joyce en français because he gave it in French and I translated it for you because I don't remember why. I think you needed it for your honors work. And that's about the court case. It was given in 1937, and it was about the court case in the United States about the publication of Ulysses. So
wow, okay, so interesting. I remember that you translated it for me, but I'd forgotten to like consider that as something of Joyce's that you'd read. Has there been any moment or event that changed your understanding of Joyce? And I think specifically in the context of having read his fiction and then like a lecture on this like legal issues that he's having, like how did your perception of him or like what the concept of like James Joyce is? How did that shift?
I think it changed at 2 points.
Okay.
First of all was when you read Ulysses.
Okay.
Second was reading The Dead, because going into James Joyce, and my understanding of James Joyce, he was very much shaped by my family and my family's opinion. Yeah, Portrait of the Artist as Young Man is a great book, but his other stuff is really hard to understand or hard to get into, or it's too avant-garde. That's kind of how I was approaching Joyce for a long time. It's like, oh, he's not readable for whatever reason. So you're the first person I knew who read, besides my dad, who read anything by James Joyce. Okay. This is kind of weird. But it was when you read Ulysses, because I remember when you read it, because it was one of those moments where it totally changed your focus and your approach to your degree and your studies. And so it really did change my voice, because like, oh, well, I know people reading James Joyce, so he can't be that bad. And you loved him. So I was like, I need to reassess my biases here. And then reading The Dead, yeah, it was kind of the same thing. So I was like, oh, this is a great, I really enjoyed the short story. I was like, oh, wow, he's not that hard to read. And for the record, this is not a James Joyce exclusive thing. This is something when I read War and Peace, I kind of had the same association going in. Same when we started reading Middlemarch, I was like, oh, this is going to be hard to read because it's old or it's long. Or it's not written in a style that I'm familiar with because I've only ever read like contemporary fiction. I remember like the first adult book I read was The Hound of the Baskervilles, and the only thing when I was like 13, and the only thing I told people is this book is really easy to read. I was surprised that I understood every word on the page. So it's not a James Joyce exclusive thing. It's something I'm still trying to overcome. It's just James Joyce, I think, still has a couple, I don't know. Sometimes I think that I have a block on James Joyce, not because I don't think that he's like a bad author, but more because, I don't know, I have an aversion to long books, and I'm a little intimidated by stream of consciousness. Yeah. I know what Ulysses is. It's just because I haven't had any kind of experience with it. So I want to invest in a long book and then have to bail halfway through.
I like that you've associated him with stream of consciousness. That's the thing that quite a few people are doing. No, it's cool. What is stream of consciousness in your understanding?
I've never read it. That's a great question. Yeah. I think stream of consciousness, I don't know. I think it's like a literary device or technique arising in the early 20th century. I associate it with two texts, actually. And I think it's because you read both of them around the same time. Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway, I think. It's not necessarily coherent, because it's as coherent as the person is thinking it. So, sometimes the way you think, the way thoughts are processed isn't necessarily logical or rational. It's just whatever comes to mind, the different associations you might make for whatever reason. And so that's kind of what I think. That's how I think of stream of consciousness. Again, never read it. So it could be something very different. I was talking with I was telling my mom about this the other day, and she's like, oh, she groaned as soon as I said, we're gonna have a conversation about James Joyce. She's like, oh, really?
Dang. Well, ask her if she wants to be interviewed. I'd love to talk to her about that reaction. But
yeah, it was a really strong reaction for someone who's never read James Joyce. I just also
interesting.
I remember
oh my
James
gosh.
Yes.
That's so interesting. I would love to know why. That's cool.
Yeah. So in terms of like encounters James Joyce, yeah, not much. Sometimes, I mean, I didn't actually know that it was the centenary, the publication of Ulysses, until I got the outline for this. Because you said, did you do anything with the centenary? I was like, there's a centenary coming up? Has it passed yet? Have I marked it? And then it happened last week. So I ended up reading 2 articles about it, more or less. The one that I sent to you about publication and the influence, and then I actually read another one, and I thought this one was kind of strange.
Okay.
Sorry, there's a construction site. It's very loud.
That's okay. I can hear it.
It was on, both of them were on the BBC. One of them was a news article. One of them was more of an arts piece for BBC Culture, which I read quite regularly. Okay. And it was about other influential books that came out in 1922.
Interesting.
So it's a centenary of James Joyce's Ulysses, but it wasn't the only important book that came out this year. So it was kind of strange in the sense that it felt like they were using the centenary as an opportunity to take away, as an opportunity to spotlight other books, but by doing, it wasn't like they're spotlighting other books that have been forgotten or by other authors, or trying to restore someone else's reputation or the place in literary history. It was just, James Joyce isn't everything. James Joyce isn't all he's cracked up to be. Sinclair Lewis, he wrote a book that year. Let's talk about Sinclair Lewis. It was just a very strange experience.
Weird. Yeah, that's interesting, because I know there is, and I originally thought I was going to do this in my master's, but I don't think so anymore. But there is quite more of a push to sort of contextualize these big canonical white dudes like James Joyce, contextualize them with people that have been, forgotten or written out of the canon. So I could see how it makes sense if it was sort of recuperating or doing that archival work. But yeah, it seems weird to just use it to kind of be other people that we already know about as well.
Yeah, and it was weird. And then they mentioned something they're yeah, Sinclair Lewis, he was a critic of Ulysses, and he wrote a book in 1922, and it was just a very strange thing. Yeah. It was can we just take the moment? This is a big deal. This book has been in print since 1922. Come on. That's a big deal for any book.
It is. Yeah, that's true.
It was just so strange.
Why do you think that Ulysses is still in print 100 years later?
Well, probably, I mean, I think this comes back to the fact that it's influential, but I don't know how it's influential. I think it's a very important book for whatever reason. I do not know. I think the court case surrounding Ulysses kind of is indicative of that, because it touched on things that made people uncomfortable, or made people think about things that they may not necessarily want to think about. So, which is the way I take censorship for the most part. So I think that kind of helps explain why it's so influential. But I don't really know. Again, I don't really know if I can answer, because I don't have enough experiences with Ulysses to be yes, this is it. This is why this is the thing.
That's okay. So, I think, again, I don't want to, pull back the veil on Oz too much, but definitely a big part of my project is that I don't think that there should be one, this is right, this is the answer, this is what Ulysses is. I don't think that there should be any one answer like that. And if it was, I don't think that it should be with a group of old white male professors telling all the rest of us how to read. So I think, no, I appreciate your answer and think that it's awesome.
I think also the context in which it is written is important.
Okay.
I'm not very familiar with the context, but I think the context of Ireland at that time, I think, isn't a factor. And I know this is something you were thinking about when you started your master's. I remember I was talking about this, but I think it might be an important factor as well.
What is that coming from a space of you just value contextualizing literature in general, or is there something specific about Joyce that requires that look at the context?
I don't think it's specific to Joyce.
Okay.
I'm a historian. Contextualizing what I do. This is what I love to do. I just wrote, I'm working on a project, and that's all I'm doing is trying to contextualize this one document. So it's just something I think is always important. And I know at the time, given the changes that were going on in Ireland, I think we can't lose sight of those. I guess you can call them epiphenomena, which is funny because I actually just don't like to, in my own work, I don't like to think about epiphenomena. And because usually that means that someone's taking away from the work itself or from the thing I'm trying to study itself. But I think in this case, they can help us understand better, more. I don't know. I recently read an article about Beowulf, because I'm studying Anglo-Saxon world, in which all the person did was look at the thief in Beowulf and go, okay, who is this person? And to do that, they had to contextualize, and they couldn't just contextualize in Britain. They had to expand their net into the wider Germanic world, the medieval Scandinavian world. So they were looking at like Icelandic sagas and Icelandic law codes and like Scandinavian law codes and all of this kind of stuff in order to contextualize. And this is an example of what I think it helps us understand the text better. And this is just a general thing. This is not a James Joyce specific thing. I just think it would be, it's helpful to consider.
Yeah, for sure. No, thank you.
The only thing that I like to add is in terms of like that lecture I read, James Joyce's French is very good.
Okay.
Random factoid. I would like, because when I translated it, I was like, man, he writes like me. And it was like a really fun experience to like have this recognition of like, I don't know, kind of humanized him. He wasn't just some kind of giant of literature. He was just a guy who spoke French as a second language. And I was like, this is cool. I relate to this.
I love that. That's amazing. That's cool to think about. I feel recently I was talking to one of the 20th century literature professors here, and we were discussing how Joyce uses languages a lot to think, I don't know necessarily of himself, but sort of to define like citizenship more in terms of like European rather than specifically like Irish or like as part of like a British colony or that sort of thing. So that Joyce, because he spoke a lot of languages, and I think he picked them up quite quickly. So that idea that being able to speak like French and Italian for him was this way to like reinvest himself with a European citizenship rather than depending on Ireland. Perfect.
I think the project is really cool. I should mention that. I think it's a really interesting idea. But then again, I also love like historiography, and this is basically historiography for literature, and I think it's great. So
amazing. I love that description. That's cool. I hadn't thought of that. What makes you say that?
Well, perhaps it's just like it's a me thing. I spent a lot of time last year reading like the philosophy of history and like all these like things that you have to consider, like methodology, historiography. And it's something that I really enjoyed, and it's something that I like continue to enjoy. Like a large part of my work is trying to think about assumptions and expectations and how people apply those to a specific subject. In my case, slavery. And I think this is the same. You're trying to think about those expectations and assumptions that are made about James Joyce and think about how people approach him in that context. It's something I enjoy, looking at assumptions and expectations, and in this project, I think, looks at those assumptions around Joyce and tries to get people to think about them and why they might have them. And to me, it just feels like a very similar kind of project. And I'm all for it. I love this stuff. This is my bread and butter. So yeah, I'm in a course right now, and it's called Celtic Christianity. I thought I was like, oh, we're going to learn about like early medieval Christianity and like Ireland and Scotland and whatever. No, it's not at all. It's about how people interpret this time period and how people think about it and the way that they approach it. And I was like, this is the greatest thing ever. Yeah. So
that sounds baller.
Yeah. Anyway, so I feel like this is very similar.
What will you remember most about this conversation that we had? Whether it be something that was frustrating or that changed your opinion a little bit, or a random cool fun fact that you know now?
Yeah, for me, probably the language thing. Languages are really important for me. So I think it's kind of interesting to think about Joyce in that way. But also, I kind of need to go read Joyce now. I need to read more Joyce.
Yes,
I can't, because I was here going like, shoot, I can't answer some of these questions because I haven't read enough. So I guess that's my takeaways. Gotta go read more Joyce.